All right, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
We're looking at China, a place that a lot of folks see as like really safe, right?
Right.
Super safe. But lately, there have been some incidents, some really tragic events that I think kind of challenge that image.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about these two specific car attacks. One that happened in Zhuhai on November 11th, and another in Chande just a week later.
Right.
And, these weren't just like, accidents. These were deliberate. These are acts of violence. And it's got a lot of people asking what's going on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you're right. That perception of safety in China has always been very high. So
Yeah.
these events, they're really jarring. They really shake things up. It makes you think.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with that first one, the Zhuhai attack.
Okay.
So the guy who did it, his name was Fan Weike, and he drove his car into a crowd, killed 35 people. It's awful. And the thing is, like, what's really disturbing is that they're saying his motive was anger over a property dispute from his divorce.
Oh, wow.
Like, that's heavy.
Yeah. It's a very personal thing
Yeah.
to lead to such a massive, a violent act like that. It's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, what kind of pressures are people under?
Right.
Because, China's gone through these, like, massive changes,
That's
right?
huge.
Economically, socially, like, just massive changes over the last few decades.
Mhm.
And of course, there's been all this incredible progress, but there's also, like, this feeling that the gap between the haves and the have-nots, it's just getting wider.
Right.
And then you add in, like, the pressure to succeed, the competition for resources, for everything, and it's easy to see how things could, like, boil over.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what you're hitting on is a sense of frustration, right? If people feel like they're being left behind or that the system is rigged against them,
Yeah.
it can lead to a lot of anger and resentment. And I think that's especially true when you think about, like, the legal system in China.
Right.
If someone feels like they've been wronged, like they have no recourse, no way to fight back, it's a recipe for desperation. It's like, what else can they do?
Yeah. It's like, where do you turn when you feel like there's nowhere to turn?
Exactly.
And that kind of brings us to the second attack, the one in Changzhou. This one is even more perplexing because, like, all we really know is the outcome. The driver, he got the death penalty, but with a 2-year reprieve.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, we don't know the motive. Like, they haven't released any information about why he did it.
It's almost more disturbing not knowing the why behind it.
Yeah, totally.
Because you're left with these questions. What could drive someone to do something like that? What was going on in their life?
It's like you said, it's almost more disturbing not knowing.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about, like, different legal systems around the world.
Yeah.
And how they approach these kinds of things.
Right.
We hear a lot about the death penalty in China and how it's used, like, way more often than in a lot of other countries.
It's a very complex issue.
Right. It is. What are the arguments, like, for and against using it in a case like this? Where you have this horrific act of violence.
Well, I think, on the one hand, you have people who support the death penalty, and they argue that it's a powerful deterrent, right? That it sends a message that if you commit these kinds of horrific crimes, there will be the ultimate consequence.
Right, an eye for an eye kind of thing.
Right, exactly. It's about justice. It's about ensuring that the punishment fits the crime.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have people who are strongly opposed to the death penalty no matter what.
Yeah.
And their argument is it's inhumane.
Yeah.
It's irreversible.
You can't take it back.
You can't take it back. And they also argue that it doesn't really address the root causes of crime,
Right.
the social and economic factors that might lead someone to commit a crime in the first place.
Yeah.
So, it's a really, really complex debate, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
Absolutely. And it makes the lack of information about that Changji case even more frustrating, I think. Like, we're trying to piece together this puzzle, but we're missing some really crucial pieces.
Yeah, it's like, you're trying to understand this whole picture, but you're only seeing a tiny fragment of it.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, like, are we getting the whole story? Especially when you consider that the information we do have, it's all coming from state-run media. Can you talk a little bit about, like, the role of media in China and how that might influence how these events are portrayed?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So, in China, the media is for the most part, controlled by the government. It's not like here where you have, all these different news outlets with different perspectives.
Right.
It's a much more controlled environment. And that means that sensitive topics, things like these attacks, they're often reported through a specific lens.
Right, so there's a certain narrative that they're trying to push.
Exactly. The focus is often on swift justice, showing that the authorities are in control and that they're taking decisive action.
Right.
And they tend to downplay any potential systemic issues, things that might reflect poorly on the government or on society as a whole.
Right, so it's like it's not the whole picture, it's just a very specific part of the picture that they're choosing to show.
Right. It's like they're showing you a beautifully curated garden, but they're not letting you see the weeds that are growing underneath.
Oh, that's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
So I guess what you're saying is, as people who are trying to understand this from the outside, we have to be really careful, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. We have to keep in mind that there might be a lot more to the story than what we're seeing.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to seek out diverse sources of information. Don't just rely on one news outlet or one perspective.
Right.
Try to get a more complete and nuanced understanding of what's really going on.
It's heartbreaking to think about the victims, the families whose lives have been just shattered by these events. It's a stark reminder of how fragile life is,
It is.
And how unpredictable human behavior can be. Sometimes it's just hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it really leaves us with a lot to think about, a lot to contemplate.
Yeah.
I think, as we move forward, it's important to ask ourselves, what do these attacks tell us about, what's happening beneath the surface of Chinese society? Are they just isolated incidents, or are they a sign of deeper, maybe even more troubling social shifts?
Yeah, I think those are really important questions for us to consider. And as you continue exploring this topic, I would just encourage you to think critically about the information that you come across.
Yes.
Question your assumptions.
Absolutely.
And seek out those diverse perspectives, because sometimes, those really tough questions, those are the ones that lead to the most valuable insights.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been heavy, but it's been important.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.
See them.